Good evening. Good evening. Thank you for the very nice introduction. The topic of my talk tonight is Paul Revere, the man behind the myth. We'll talk a little bit about who Paul Revere actually was, and then oppose that to who we all think of Paul Revere as, or a lot of people think Paul Revere as, many of the stories that have been told about him, especially about his midnight ride, but then also about other parts of his life as well. And what I'd like to start off, one thing I'd like to say is that although I will take questions and answers at the end, by all means you don't have to wait till the end to ask your question. If you have a question, I'd be happy to take it any time during the presentation. And what I'd like to start off right away is this well-known view of Paul Revere. This is the famous John Singleton Copley portrait of Revere. It shows him when he's 33 years old in 1768. This is 7 years before the Revolutionary War broke out, and before Paul Revere went on his famous ride and did many of the other things that he's most famous for. One of the first myths that you generally think of is that Paul Revere was young when he went on his famous ride, that he was maybe in his mid-20s, but he wasn't. He was 40 years old, which is a little older than we generally think. And this is a very nice portrait. It's considered to be one of Copley's best, and it shows Revere as a working man, which is a little bit unusual for a colonial era portrait. And he's got a piece of silver in his left hand and some engraving tools scattered about the table, although the table's a little bit fancy for a workbench. But it's really a very well-known portrait. It's at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. So this is the real Paul Revere. Now we're going to take a look at the mythological Paul Revere. This is the Paul Revere we all became familiar with in grade school or when you're reading books. There's thousands of pictures like this. This shows Paul Revere waiting for the signals from the North Church Tower across the river from Charlestown, and he's got his horse, he's booted and spurred. And the man here looks like a kind of tall, slim gentleman, maybe about 25 years old. You notice his haircut, he's got a ponytail clipped at the back. That's an upper-class haircut. Whereas in reality, Paul Revere had the classic roundhead, Puritan roundhead haircut, which is cut straight around the back, no ponytail, no ribbon in his hair or anything like that. The other thing about this picture is that it shows an event that never happened. Paul Revere was never waiting for the signals across the river. The signals were shown, but at that point, Paul Revere was still in Boston. The signals were not to Paul Revere, as the famous poem has it. They were actually from Paul Revere, and they were for the people in Charlestown across the river in case Revere was not able to successfully leave town. And this is a signal system which Revere himself had devised the previous weekend in order to guard against the fact that when the British troops moved out of Boston, possibly no messengers would be able to get out. And this was a simple way of getting the word out that in fact the troops had left Boston. And I'll go into this a little bit later in a little bit more detail about Revere's ride. But first I'd like to step back a little bit and talk a little bit about Paul Revere's ancestry and his family. As you may have heard, Paul Revere was of French descent on his father's side. His father's name was Apollos Rivoire, R-I-V-O-I-R-E, and he was born in a small village in the southwest of France, a little village not too far from Bordeaux called Riaucourt. And this is a house in that village which may have been the house that Paul Revere's father grew up in. If it wasn't this exact house, it might have been a different building on the same foundation, or it might be a different building on the same property. We're not really sure. But his father was born in the southwest of France. When he was 13 years old, his family sent him to the New World, possibly to escape persecution, or possibly for economic opportunity, because most of Paul Revere's French relatives were Protestant. They were Huguenots. And many of them had been persecuted during the time of great persecution in the late 1600s. By the early 1700s, you didn't have real fierce persecution, but it was always possible that it might crop up again. And so we don't know exactly why Revere's father was sent to the New World, but it could be for the possibility of persecution, or it might have been for economic opportunity. In any case, he arrived here in Boston. He was apprenticed to a local goldsmith. By the way, when I do my talks about Revere, I use the term goldsmith and silversmith interchangeably. those days were generally goldsmith. The trade is the same. Goldsmiths were expected to work in both gold and silver. Naturally, they did more of their work in silver than gold, especially here in the colonies. So we tend to refer to Paul Revere and his father as a silversmith. He tended to refer to himself as a goldsmith. Either term is the same. It's the same trade. So Revere's father was apprenticed to a local goldsmith named John Coney, and after his master died, he set himself up in business. Here we have some silver and gold work that was done by Revere's father, especially those little gold buttons down at the bottom. Those are rather exquisitely done. It's sometimes said that Paul Revere's father was not as good of a goldsmith as he was. That's really not true. From a little bit of the small number of pieces that we have, it's clear that he was fairly proficient as a goldsmith. In the 1720s, Paul Revere's father made two important decisions. The first one was that he changed his name. He changed it first to Paul Revere, and then eventually to Paul Revere, R-E-V-E-R-E. And so what that means is the famous Paul Revere was not the first. His father was also called Paul Revere for most of his adult life. And also in 1729, he got married. He married Deborah Hitchborn from a local Boston family. This is a Bible that was owned by Deborah Hitchborn. This is currently in the collection of the Old North Church in Boston. Although I think it's been on deposit at the Massachusetts Historical Society for a long time, so I'm not sure whether it's actually at the church or there. But this is a Bible that was owned by his mother. And this is the section of town that Paul Revere was born in. This is the North End section of Boston, the same as the Italian North End today. Paul Revere was born there in very late 1734. He attended a local writing school, which is kind of like a modern-day elementary school, and then he apprenticed with his father to learn to be a goldsmith. This engraving, it's a pretty good engraving. This is one that was done by Revere himself. The only building in this engraving that's still there is the church, not the church on the far right that you can barely see, but the large church right next to it. That is Christ Church, now known as the Old North Church. And that is where the signals were shown the night of Revere's Ride. In the past, that church was sometimes confused with the smaller church down front, which is the Old North Meeting House. And then also on the left, the church on the far left was the church that Paul Revere himself and his family attended. That was known as the Seventh Congregational Church, or sometimes known as the Cockrell Church, because if you look closely, you realize there is a rooster weather vane at the top of the spire. It was also sometimes called the New Brick Church, I suppose, because it was one of the first ones to be built in brick. And like most port cities in those days, the two most important features that you'd see in a city like Boston would be the churches and also the wharves. The large wharf in the middle was known as Clark's Wharf, and the little bit of long wharf down there at the bottom left, that's the same as today. That's where the New England Aquarium is today. And the Revere Silver Shop was it was at the head of Clark's Wharf, which means it was right where Clark's Wharf joined the land. His father actually died fairly young. He died in his early 50s. At that point, Paul was 19 years old. That was a little bit too young to take over the family business. He took it over again a couple of years later, but just about at the same time, the French and Indian War had broken out, and Paul Revere was commissioned as an officer in a Massachusetts expedition that went into upstate New York, pretty near where Lake George is today, to try to capture a small French fort. This is the type of encampment Revere would have been familiar with. At that time. Fairly typical example. You can see the tents of the officers there in the background and the smaller tents of the men right up front. If you look closely, you realize it's laundry day because they've got their laundry drying over the tops of the tents. And this has got a parade ground. You've even got some well-dressed ladies visiting the encampment. I don't think there were too many upper-class ladies that visited the encampment in upstate New York. In fact, very little was accomplished on this expedition. And Revere, at the end of the summer, Revere and his fellow troops marched back into Boston. And I have since discovered why nothing happened. It was during that summer that the overall command of the British forces in America changed. And the local commander was replaced by a man named Lord Loudun, who was a professional Scottish soldier. And he didn't understand how the local militias were organized. there was a lot of misunderstanding. And so not much was accomplished anywhere in the summer of 1756. And later, the next year, they did send an expedition to capture the same fort and was successful, but by that time, Revere was no longer in the Army. After his expedition in upstate New York, he came back into Boston. He set up he went back to his silversmithing business. Over the next 10 or 15 years, he concentrated on building up his business as much as he could. This is an early example of Revere silver. One of the things about Revere as a silversmith is he was very good at following whatever was the prevailing style. And in the 1760s and 1770s, it was the highly decorated Rococo style of silver, of which this is a fairly restrained example. After the war, the neoclassical style became popular. This is a neoclassical style tea set, which was made in the Revere silver shop in the 1790s. By this time, in fact, Paul Revere didn't have too much personally to do with the shop anymore because he had turned the day-to-day operations over to his oldest son, also named Paul Jr., we usually call him, because he was getting involved in other businesses, which I'll talk about later. So how much Revere personally had to do with these pieces is probably fairly minimal. Yes?
To what extent did Revere work with pewter?
He didn't. He is only known to have made one piece of pewter, which was a pewter eagle that he made for someone. We also have a spoon mold, which is supposedly he used to make spoons for his own family's use. It's often thought that Revere did a lot of work in pewter, I think primarily because many Revere reproductions have been done in pewter. But I was told by a silversmith that, in fact, if you were going to try to work in both pewter and silver, you would have to have two entirely different sets of tools. But because working on the pewter picks up little bits of small particles of pewter, and then you would contaminate the silver with it. There would be another problem, too. The pewtersmiths might get a little bit upset if the silversmiths were horning in on their business. So there really is, there's no evidence. I'm sure he dabbled around in it because he's a fairly inquisitive person, and so I'm sure he may have tried it a little bit, but he didn't do it for a business. One thing he did do, he was an engraver. Many silversmiths were engravers. This is one of the more elaborate Revere engravings. By the way, how is the clarity of these pictures? Are these okay? Okay. They're fuzzy to me, so I just want to be sure. This is a masthead for a newspaper, for a Boston newspaper. This is one of the more elaborate Revere engravings, commercial engravings. This is another one of his commercial engravings. This is a book plate done for a local family. And then Revere was also a dentist. But there's one thing about his dentistry career which you may have heard, which is not correct. He did not make a set of teeth for George Washington. He didn't have that much skill. He did wire in individual false teeth. He stole teeth. He made teeth and he sold toothpaste, clean teeth and sold toothpaste to make a little extra money in the years before the Revolutionary War. I'll read a little bit of this. You might not be able to make it out. It says here, artificial teeth. Paul Revere takes this method of returning his most sincere thanks to the gentlemen and ladies who have employed him in the care of their teeth. He would now inform them and all others who are so unfortunate as to lose their teeth by accident or other ways that he continues the business of a dentist, etc., etc., etc. He's fixed some hundreds of teeth, and that he can fix them well as any surgeon dentist. Paul Revere never claimed to be a surgeon dentist. He never tried to pull teeth. And he claims they can be an ornament of real use in speaking and eating. Well, I don't know about that. And that he will wait on any gentleman or lady at their lodging, so he does make house calls. And then he may be spoke with at his shop opposite Dr. Clark's at the North End. We have two of these advertisements for his dentistry business. One of the things that's important about them is that you can use them to try to pin down where the silver shop was. And as you may know, Paul Revere used his business skills, his craft skills for political purposes. This is his most famous piece of political silver, probably his most famous piece of silver of any kind. This is the well-known Liberty Bowl, or Rescinder's Bowl as it's sometimes called. It was made to commemorate a political event. In 1768, as you may also know, the British government passed a number of tax measures, generally known as the Townshend Acts, which were not popular here in the colonies. And the Massachusetts House of Representatives sent a circular letter to the other colonies protesting the Townshend Acts. And the government demanded that they rescind that letter. Now, they couldn't literally call it back, but they were supposed to disavow it, and they were supposed to expunge it from their records. And the Massachusetts House of Representatives voted 92 to 17 not to rescind the letter. So this bowl was made to commemorate the 92 members who refused to rescind. Paul Revere also did a satirical engraving of the 17 who voted to rescind. I don't have it with me, unfortunately, but it shows the 17 being herded down into the jaws of hell, which is like a giant dragon with devils floating all over. They had a good time with the political engravings. And then this is the most famous piece of political engraving. This is the Boston Massacre engraving, actually copied from a plate done by another man, which was fairly common in those days, although in this case, Revere managed to copy the plate so quickly and get his prints out for sale that the other man got a little upset about it. Or maybe they were supposed to collaborate. It's unclear. But in any case, as you also probably know, it's a fine piece of political propaganda. It doesn't actually show what really happened. Virtually everyone agrees that the troops did not line up in a line and fire at a volley, that they were huddled in a little circle, and they fired in a haphazard manner because they were scared. The officer that you see there behind giving the order to fire, most of the witnesses said that he did not do that. In fact, if anything, he was trying to prevent his men from firing because it was well known in the British Army that if you killed a civilian, it was a capital offense. And if you look closely, you'll notice that the people in the crowd are not the sailors, apprentices, and working people that were really in the crowd at the time. They're dressed up in waistcoats. So the idea is this is supposed to be the nasty British troops firing on the upstanding citizens of Boston. And there's some interesting poetry down below done by a man named Dr. Church, who actually turned out to be a traitor later on. The only building in this picture that's still there is the one right in the middle, in the back, which is now known as the Old State House. In those days it was called the Townhouse. And just about the time of the Boston Massacre in 1770, Paul Revere bought his first house. Prior to this, he had rented accommodations for his family, possibly in the same building where his silver shop was. In 1770, he bought this old-fashioned merchant's house on the North Square of Boston that still exists today, and it's the museum where I work. This is what we think the building looked like at the time that Revere lived there. It had already been altered quite a bit. A third story had been added at the front. The windows had been changed from the old-fashioned diamond pane windows. And it doesn't look much like it looks today. I'm going to show you a photograph at the end of the show here, and you'll see that it looks quite different today. When the restoration was done, the exterior was returned closer to what it looked like originally. But this is what we think it looked like when the Revere family first moved in the fall of spring of 1770. And I want to talk a little bit about his family. Paul Revere was married twice. He was the father of 16 children total. Out of the 16, 11 survived, which is that's actually a pretty good mortality rate. And most of them married, and many of them had large families, so the genealogy got very big very fast. Today there are thousands of people descended from Paul Revere all over the world, including the president of our board. The president of our board is named Paul Revere Jr. He's a direct descendant. His father was named Paul Revere, his son is named Paul Revere III, and his grandson is named Paul Revere IV. Paul Revere III is also on the board. He's a lawyer down on the Cape. But Paul Revere IV is 12, so I don't think he's not on the board yet. We don't have any portraits of his first wife, Sarah Horn. This is a portrait of his second wife, Rachel, also from a local family. It's kind of interesting because Rachel was an only child, which was very unusual in those days. And she was 28 when she married Paul Revere, and that was her first marriage. That was a little bit older than average for a first marriage. And having been an only child, it must have been quite a culture shock to walk into to a family that was a widower and 6 children surviving from his first marriage. And but she seems to have been a pretty capable woman. And she and her husband Paul exchanged letters right after the war broke out, right after his famous ride, where they discussed getting the family out of town, and she had to go get passes from the British, and she had to bribe a British sergeant in order to be able to get them. And so she's a pretty capable person. And she lived to be 68 years old. His first wife only lived into her late 30s, but she lived to be 68. This is a miniature portrait done by a man named Joseph Dunkerley, who actually lived in the house lived in Paul Revere's house for a while, because right after the war, the Revere family moved out of their North Square house for about 10 years and then moved back later. We're not exactly sure why, but they decided they wanted to rent it out, and Joseph Dunkerley was one of the renters. And in the early 1770s, Paul Revere got more personally involved in politics. He was a member of a group called the North Caucus, which met very often here at the Green Dragon Tavern. Down at the bottom it says, where we met to plan the consignment of a few shiploads of tea, December 16, 1773. According to tradition, and there is some evidence for this as well, most of the planning for the Boston Tea Party took place at meetings of the North Caucus here at the Green Dragon in November and December of 1773, and Paul Revere was involved in those meetings. Whether he actually took part in the Tea Party, we don't really know. He is alleged to, but nobody knows for sure exactly who took part. And here we have one of many, many views of the Boston Tea Party, a fairly well-known incident. At least in this case, they're actually dumping the contents of the chests overboard. Sometimes you see pictures of the Tea Party where the men dressed up as Indians are throwing entire chests of tea overboard, which would have been a good trick since the chests weighed 450 pounds each. Also, if you throw the chests overboard, they quite likely could float and you could recover a lot of the tea. They wanted to make sure it was destroyed. And so they chopped them apart and threw the contents overboard. 360 chests of tea, several million pounds worth of tea, tens of millions of dollars in modern day money. This was a major destruction of property. This is something the British government could not ignore. Up until the Tea Party, most of what was going on here in Boston and also in the other colonies could be kind of written off as just trouble in the colonies. And the colonies were not considered to be all that important to the home countries anyway. But this was really a major destruction of property, and they really felt they couldn't let this go by, and they didn't. They passed a number of laws called the Intolerable Acts, which closed the port of Boston, transferred the colonial capital to Salem, Massachusetts, and, most important, the Massachusetts Government Act, which totally rearranged how the government of Massachusetts was organized and paid. Most of the officers would be appointed and paid from England. All of the judges would be appointed and paid from England, not locally. And the town meetings could only be held once a year. The agenda had to be approved in advance, and they couldn't discuss anything other than routine business. This was considered to be a totally unwarranted overthrow of the sacred Massachusetts Charter and provoked almost immediate opposition in the countryside, so that within about 6 months, the British had essentially lost control of the countryside. By the fall of 1774, basically they just controlled Boston. Now, politics was a little bit rough in those days. This is a famous tar and feathering of a man named John Malcolm. The number of tar and featherings that actually took place was somewhat limited, because very often the threat of a tar and feathering was enough to get somebody to come around to your point of view. Whether you think this sort of procedure is actions by principal patriots or terrorism by bully boys is really dependent a lot on your point of view. In the case of John Malcolm, he had the reputation of being a customs informer. And what that meant was that he ratted on his neighbors. When they wouldn't pay their customs duties, he would turn them in. So he was not popular. And in January of 1774, he was also apparently kind of a nasty person. And a mob grabbed him, gave him a modern jacket, a suit of tar and feathers. What they would do is they would pour warm tar all over your body. If you're lucky, they poured it over your clothes. But otherwise, they pour it over your bare skin. And then they would shake feathers all over you, obviously to make you look ridiculous, which I think it succeeded at. If you've ever got pitch on your hands, you realize it can be really annoying. If you imagine getting it all over you, that's even more annoying. In the case of John Malcolm, it was pretty cold when they did this, and they carried him around from place to place in Boston. They made him drink tea to the health of the king and queen. This is right after the Tea Party. Eventually he drank so much tea that he vomited. And he also got frostbite. And so when they pulled the tar and feathers off, big strips of his skin came off as well. And it was thought he would not survive, but he did. And as I mentioned, sometimes the threat of this kind of treatment was enough to get somebody to come around to your point of view. And people were not the only things that were tar and feathered. In a couple of cases, a house was tar and feathered. In one case, a document was tar and feathered, and I think in one case, someone's horse was, although I don't know how the horse put up with that. And here's what Boston looked like in those days. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, talking about the Massachusetts Government Act, just to give you an example. There was a group which still exists today called the Governor's Council, which actually had more power in those days than it does today. And according to the Massachusetts Government Act, the governor's councilors would be appointed by the king or by the king's government and would be paid from England. So when the new councilors showed up to take up their duties, they were met by crowds of their neighbors outside of their door. These were Massachusetts men who were appointed. And the crowd gave them an offer they couldn't refuse. They could either immediately resign their position as councilor, or they could face the just resentment of their friends and neighbors. And so these men would look out the window and they would see their friends with pitchforks and guns and stuff like that and would think it over. Most of them immediately resigned. A few of them skedaddled out the back door and skedaddled back to Boston. So very quickly, any of the governor's councilors who were still left were Boston, and the rest had all resigned. So you can see how basically this was true of judges as well. They were met by crowds and they were forced, in most cases, forced to resign. So basically, the British administration had pretty much evaporated in the countryside in Massachusetts by the fall of 1774. So this is Boston. This is what the British controlled. In those days, Boston was pretty much an island. The only way you could get out of town was down at the bottom there where out Boston met. That's today's Washington Street. And then you would keep going down what's now Washington Street, and you would hit the town of Roxbury, which was the first town that you would get to on the mainland. So if you're going to go by land, you're going to have to go that way. The only other way out of town would be to go by water. And on the eastern side is a nice deep water harbor, but many of the other areas are mudflats. And this is important. And also up at the top, you can see a little bit of Charlestown, which is, again, today part of Boston, but in those days was a separate town. This is the importance of the one if by land, two if by sea story that came out of the Longfellow poem, which really should be one if by land, two if by river. Because the troops were either going to go by land out Boston Neck, or they were going to take small boats across the river. What the British had done is they had brought their boats from the main harbor, they'd launched them from the ships, brought them up around the top there, the end of the Charles River, and then down to the edge of the common, just on the left-hand side of this map. And they were all lined up there. And the British were going to take small boats across the river from there. Paul Revere had arranged to have the signals shown in the North Church Tower, and the point was that if the troops went by land, it would probably take them a lot longer. They would march out Boston Neck, they'd have to go all the way around Back Bay, all the way into what is now Brighton, cross over the bridge into Cambridge, and then march from there out to Lexington. Probably 5 or 6 extra miles of marching. So presumably if they went by water, it would take them less time. It turns out they were so slow, it really didn't matter that much anyway, but that was the idea. And Revere had arranged the signals in the Old North Church, which is right up in the north end, which is that sort of blob of land up in the upper right-hand corner. He had arranged the signals in case nobody else could get out of town to warn people in the countryside that the troops in fact had left. The fact that they were going to march in the countryside was no surprise. They'd already done it several times beforehand. It was just a question of when and which way they would go. By the way, people often wonder, why did Henry Wadsworth Longfellow tell the story wrong? Why did he have Revere waiting in Charlestown for the signals when in fact Revere was still in Boston when the signals were being shown? Did he just not know the real story? Well, it turns out research that's been done by a local historian in Boston has pretty conclusively demonstrated, or at least indicated, that Longfellow in fact knew the real story and had read Revere's own account of his ride. If that's true, then it means that Longfellow deliberately changed the story around. Why did he do that? Because he was a poet. He was trying to write write a stirring poem, and it's important. It was written in 1860, and this is right before the Civil War broke out. He was trying to write a poem to warn that the Union would be in danger. And he was trying to draw a parallel with what was happening in 1775 when the colonies here were in danger. And the fact he wanted to make the poem simpler and more stirring, so he just changed the story around. He's a poet, he's not a historian. But unfortunately, his version has become the traditional version, and people don't realize that it's not actually what happened. This is the Old North Church. One of the reasons that it was picked to have the signal lanterns is that it faces north. And the signals were shown right there near the top, right below the bell tower. And here we have Paul Revere being rowed across the river. We actually know quite a bit about Reveres Ride. Let me just check my time for a second. Okay. We know quite a bit about Reveres Ride because he wrote about it. He wrote about it right at the time that it happened, just afterwards, for a deposition that was being collected. They were collecting depositions to try to prove that the British had started everything. He also wrote about it later. He added information later in a letter to the man who was organizing the Massachusetts Historical Society. We know that Paul Revere was sent for by an unknown person, was sent to meet Dr. Joseph Warren, who was the last major patriot leader in Boston. And when he got to Dr. Warren's surgery, he discovered a couple of things. Number one, that the British troops were about to march into the countryside. That was no surprise. Everyone knew that was going to happen. But he also found out Warren had gotten a new piece of intelligence. One of Warren's spies had told him that the British were going to stop in the town of Lexington to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were staying at a house there. And the only reason they were staying there is John Hancock's had some relatives there. And Warren in particular wanted Revere to stop in Lexington to make sure that Adams and Hancock got out of the way. Revere also discovered that another man had already been sent out into the countryside, a man named William Dawes. But he had taken the land route. He had gone out Boston Neck and around Back Bay. So that even though he left before Revere, he actually got to Lexington slightly after Revere. In any case, after Revere talked to Warren, he came back into his own neighborhood. He contacted a friend, probably the sexton of the church, to set the signals in the North Church Tower. Then he walked back to his house and picked up his boots and his overcoat. Then he walked up to the waterfront where a couple friends had a small boat hidden behind a wharf. The British had confiscated most small boats, but they had missed this one. And the two friends rowed Revere across the river. And you can see in the background there's a large British ship. That's the HMS Somerset, which was a large frigate, which was anchored right where the ferries normally crossed between Boston and Charlestown. And it was assumed that anyone who tried to leave Boston by water would have gone somewhere near there. So Revere and his two companions had to angle out into the harbor a little bit. It's a pretty good picture of what actually happened. You can see the Old North Church there in the background on the left. Revere is dressed in his boots and his overcoat, and that overcoat looks like they did in those days. It was called a surtout, which means overall. And there are multiple layers of cloth at the shoulders in order to shed water. There's just one thing I always question. Why is it whenever they show a famous person being rowed across a body of water, they're always standing up? One wave comes along and he's in the drink. The other thing is that they're trying to avoid being seen by sentries on the Somerset. I mean, why not stand up and wave? I also want to tell you a couple of other stories which are connected with this particular event. These stories go back a long ways. There's no documentary evidence for them. I'll just let you decide how credible you think they are. The first story is that on his way up to the waterfront, Paul Revere suddenly realized that he had forgotten his spurs. He also noticed that his pet dog, his little dog, had followed him up to the waterfront. So being conveniently prepared with pencil and paper, he didn't have a spurs, but he had pencil and paper. He wrote a note attached to the dog's collar. The dog returned to his house. Rachel read the note, attached the spurs to the dog's collar, and the dog returned to the waterfront. Very smart dog. Then they discovered they didn't have anything to muffle the oarlocks with. The guys didn't seem too well prepared. You can even see some cloth there where the oarlocks are. And the way the oarlocks are done is pretty accurate, the way they're done. One of the two men, this is the story, one of the two men had a lady friend, a fiancée living nearby. He went over to her house, probably threw some pebbles against a window. There was a whispered conversation, and then a garment fluttered down to the ground, still warm from the wearer's body. Obviously, she had no other cloth anywhere in the house. They tore that petticoat up, and they used it to muffle the oars. Now, as I mentioned, these stories do go back a long ways. I don't give them total credibility, as you can imagine. It is possible Paul Revere himself made them up to tell his grandchildren. And they've come down through the Revere family. I think there were grandchildren or great-grandchildren who actually told them to the early Revere biographers. In any case, in any event, Paul Revere was able to successfully cross the river. He then borrowed a horse from a friend and set off through the countryside. He did not say the British are coming, the British are coming. We don't know what he said at each of the houses along the roadway as he along the countryside. And he didn't race through the countryside like this. He went from house to house, trying to make as little commotion as possible because he was trying to avoid British patrols. In fact, he had almost been captured right outside of Charlestown, and he had to detour on a different road than he had originally planned to go on. When he got to Lexington, he did run into a more particular problem. This is the house where Samuel Adams and John Hancock were staying. This is the Hancock Clark mansion in Lexington. There was a sentry on duty outside this house, and the sentry didn't want to let him in the house. He told him not to make so much noise that everybody in the house was asleep. And Revere apparently got a little annoyed at the man, and he said, "Noise? You'll have noise enough before long. The regulars are coming out." And then the story is, Revere still had trouble convincing the man to let him in. John Hancock, who was still awake, he said, "Oh, you, Revere, we're not afraid of you," and they let him in the house. Now, the man who wrote this down, the sentry outside the door, he wrote it down 50 years later. But I think his memory was probably pretty good, as I'm sure everyone in this room remembers exactly where they were when September 11th took place. I do. I was doing an elder hostel program in Boston. I'm sure you also remember exactly where you were when you found out that John Kennedy was killed. I was taking a geometry test in 10th grade, last period. And my parents remember exactly where they were when they found out about Pearl Harbor. This is just something you remember. So I think this man's memory was probably pretty good. So I'm willing to accept that this is what really happened at the Hancock Clark mansion. So Revere was allowed in the house. Here he is delivering his message to Adams and Hancock. As you can see, most of these people are appropriately dressed in night dress, except those two people on the right-hand side, who look like they're prepared to party all night. The man standing there, if you notice, he has a rifle in his hand. I know that's supposed to be John Hancock, and the woman is his fiancée, Dorothy Quincy, who was staying in the house. We know that later on, not right at this point, but several hours later, when the troops were about to march on the Lexington Green, John Hancock wanted to stand out with the militia and grab a rifle and stand out with the militia. And it took Adams quite a bit of effort to convince him not to do that wouldn't be a wise thing to do. Soon after this, when Dawes arrived, Dawes and Revere refreshed themselves, got something to eat and drink. They then decided to go on to the town of Concord, which was actually a more important objective. On the way, they were captured by a British patrol finally. Dawes escaped. We're not sure exactly how, but before that, the two of them had been joined by another man, a man named Dr. Samuel Prescott, who was a local man. Prescott and Revere were stopped from continuing any farther. They were herded down into a meadow. Prescott then said, "Put on," which basically means scatter. The two men rode off in two different directions. Being a local man, Prescott was able to hop his horse over a fence and ride off through the woods. He, in fact, was able to successfully arrive in Concord. For that reason, it's sometimes said that Samuel Prescott finished Reveres Ride, which strictly speaking is true, although when you say that, it makes it seem like Revere sort of just gave up after a while and went home, which isn't true. Revere tried the same thing as Prescott, but he headed for the wrong patch of woods. He was recaptured by another group of soldiers. He was interrogated for a while, as you see here. He was actually threatened a bit, and then he was eventually let go, although his horse was confiscated. And Revere made his way back into Lexington on foot. In fact, he saw the British troops march onto Lexington Green, but he didn't see very much of the battle because at that point he and John Hancock's secretary were carrying away a trunk of papers which John Hancock had left behind. And they couldn't quite see what was happening because Revere says that a building got in the way, so they couldn't actually see the troops and the militia firing at each other, although they could hear it. Okay, we've got to 1775 and Paul Revere's famous ride. Paul Revere lived to be 83, so that's 43 more years. What did he do for the rest of his life? What did he do for an encore? Well, I'll just do a brief survey of the latter part of his life. Anything so spectacular as the Midnight Ride, but during the war, for the first year of the war, he and his family lived in the town of Watertown, and Revere was hired by the government of Massachusetts to print currency to be used to pay the troops. Here we have a plate that is engraved with 8 bills, and then you've got a couple of the actual bills right at the top there that were used to pay the local troops. Revere was also involved in obtaining cannon and gunpowder for the Massachusetts militia. In 1776, he joined the Massachusetts militia as an officer. He wanted a commission in the Continental Army, but he was never able to get it. For most of the war, for most of the next 3 years, he was the commander of this fort in Boston Harbor, known as Castle William. Today it's known as Castle Island. Today it's connected to South Boston, but in those days it was a separate island. Revere also took part in several local expeditions, and then one large expedition up to Maine, which was a major failure, resulted in a lot of recriminations, and that was pretty much the end of his military career, along with several other people. Once back in Boston, as I mentioned, he concentrated on his business activities. His plan was to use the profits from his goldsmith shop, which would be operated by his son under his inspection, and he would use the profits to invest in new businesses. He tried to be a merchant for a while. This is an advertisement for his hardware store business. This business never really did that well, and when something better came along, he jumped at it. His own church had a bell that had cracked. They asked him to try to recast it. Revere was able to do that. He basically taught himself the trade of bell casting, which is kind of impressive. This is a 45, 46-year-old man who basically learned this on his own. And he was never apprenticed to be a bell caster. This is a bell that we have on the site of the Paul Revere house that was cast in the Revere foundry. Revere also manufactured cannon, cast quite a number of cannon for state governments and also for the new federal government. And he manufactured quite a bit of ship fittings, bolts and spikes and nails for the local shipyards, including most of the ship fittings that were used when the USS Constitution was built in the north end of Boston in the 1790s. Here's Revere when he's 65 years old. This is the second portrait. This is the only one that we own at the Revere house. At this point, he could have retired, but rather than do that, he sunk most of his assets into a new business. He bought some property south of Boston in the town of Canton, Massachusetts. Then it was part of Stoughton, but it was called Cantondales. And it was an old iron mill, and he converted it into a mill for rolling sheet copper. Here we have Revere standing in the foreground. In the background is his mill property. You can see there's a house up in the background, and you can see one of the mill buildings down in the front that's being operated by water power. And he's about to go hunting with his hunting dogs. There is actually a bit of evidence for that from a poem that he wrote about his later life. Revere copper was used to plate the domes of buildings. This is the Massachusetts State House, which was first covered with copper. The dome was covered with copper, now it's covered with gold leaf. And primarily, however, Revere copper was used to plate the sides of ships. This is the USS Constitution that is being recoppered with Revere copper in the early 1800s. The copper was below the waterline. It has nothing to do with the Constitution being called old iron sides. The copper was attached to the sides of ships because it prevented shipworms from boring into the sides of ships. And shipworms are not worms. They're these odd creatures. They're actually a form of clam. They're a form of bivalve. The two shells are modified into a digging apparatus, and they have an extremely long foot. And all they do is burrow into wood and live there. and filter out water the same way, filter their food out of the water the same as clams do. But you get enough of them in the side of the ship, and it's going to destroy it. Copper also keeps barnacles from attaching to the sides of ships as well, so it serves a number of purposes. And here we have the Constitution being recoppered. The man down in the foreground is probably Revere, sort of observing what was going on. And it's a fairly good picture, although I don't think Revere was actually overseeing things like you see in here. And one of the other, an interesting business relationship that Paul Revere had in his later years was with Robert Fulton in New York City. Paul Revere supplied heavy copper sheets for the boilers of most of Robert Fulton's steamboats, including this one here. This is a double-ended catamaran warship that was manufactured by Fulton during the War of 1812. It wasn't finished in time to actually be used. It could go either direction. The paddle wheel was in the middle, and Revere supplied the heavy copper sheets for the boiler for this vessel. Here we have Revere when he's 78 years old. This is by Gilbert Stuart, and then a companion portrait of his second wife Rachel. She's 68 here. Both of these portraits were commissioned by one of their younger sons, Joseph. Actually, his name was Joseph Warren Revere. He's named after Dr. Joseph Warren, Revere's friend who was killed at the Battle of Bunker Hill. And then Paul Revere himself died in 1818. He was 83 years old. This is a marker in the granary burying ground which shows where the Revere tomb is located. Sorry I have to drink so much water. We've been talking to a lot of school groups lately. My voice is starting to go. One person on our staff, her voice was gone this morning. I just want to finish up with a couple comments about the later history of the story of Reveres Ride. As you know, Henry Waffle Longfellow wrote the famous poem in 1860. This is the first national publication in January of 1861, issue of the Atlantic Monthly, which actually came out on December 20th, 1860, although the poem had appeared 2 days earlier in the Massachusetts newspaper, Boston newspaper. Paul Revere's Ride has been memorialized in many different ways, including lunchboxes, cigar holders, liquor dispensers, and this piece of sheet music. Paul Revere's Ride March Two-Step, published in 1905. We have this in our collection at the Revere House. Somebody took this home and played it on the piano, and they said it really isn't very good. Cartoons. I'll read this in case you can't make it out. Why, Paul, how good to see you. This is Dewsbury. Evening, Amy. Is Nate home? He certainly is, Paul. What brings you out on a night like this? Nate, the British are coming. The British are coming. So it's finally happened. How much time do you figure we've got, Paul? 20, maybe 30 minutes? I only need one, you know. Really? Nate's been specially trained. And then this is Paul Revere's house as it looked in the 1890s. At this point, it was a tenement building. The ground floor was a vegetable fruit business. There's a man named Mazzaro who had run the business from 1890 right until he or his daughter, I think, ran it right until the house was restored in the early 20th century. And at this point, a plaque has already been placed on the front of the house. You can see it there between the second and the third stories by the Paul Revere chapter of the DAR, signifying that this was the house that Paul Revere lived in. In 1902, it was bought by a Revere descendant, a man named John Phillips Reynolds Jr., who was a great-grandson. And then over the next few years, an association was formed to take over the building and to raise money to restore it. They hired a well-known restoration architect to do the work, and in 1908, it was opened up as a museum. And you can see that this is a little bit of an odd angle, but even from this angle, you can see that the outside of the building doesn't look at all like the picture I showed you earlier. The third-story addition was taken off because the restorer thought it was added after Revere lived in the house. We don't agree with that. And you can see it has the old-fashioned diamond pane windows, which are the early style of window. By the time Revere lived in the house, almost certainly they were all replaced with the newer square sash window. So the outside of the house today actually looks closer to what it looked like when it was first lived in. It was built in 1680 and the first owner was a wealthy merchant. However, the inside of the house is a combination of 17th and 18th century features. We do have some examples. We have several pieces of Revere silver on display. We also have pieces of furniture that was owned by the Revere family and other personal items, including right now, we have a long iron spike or stake, which supposedly was used by Paul Revere to graze his cow on Boston Common. And we do know he had a cow because in the 1790s, he contracted with somebody to build a cow house in the back of his home here. And I think it's still true. I think if you live in Boston today, in the city limits of Boston, you are legally allowed to graze your cow on Boston Common. So we'd love to have anybody stop by and visit. I also should say, my boss would want me to say, and I should say anyway, is that we just recently acquired a building behind our site, our historic site, which we are redoing into a visitor and interpretation and visitor center, and education and visitor center, and we're trying to raise money, so if anybody has a few million sitting around, we would love to talk to them. Anyway, I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight, and I'd be happy to take any questions you might have. Yes?
Where did the copper come from?
Very, very good question. Most of Revere's copper was scrap. That was his primary raw material. And occasionally he could get copper pigs primarily from places in Europe like Turkey and Sweden. They didn't come from any, there are good copper mines in the United States today, but they weren't known about at the time. But primarily he had to melt down scrap copper, and it did cause him a problem because he had trouble getting the impurities out of it. And Robert Fulton constantly complained that that his copper was too brittle and that the rivets kept breaking. Then again, Fulton was a bit of a perfectionist, but he had to be a perfectionist. He was building boilers. And so apparently it was a continuing problem because he was using scrap as his raw material. Okay, well, I'd be happy to talk to anybody informally if they'd like. I guess there's a few goodies on the back table there.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
This program has been a production of Topsfield Cable Television.